Hello, everyone, and welcome for a new episode of Listen Up, the Girl Up ESCP podcast. Today, we're in a special month. It's Women's Month. And for this special occasion, we wanted to answer a specific question. Do we still need feminism today?
We could think that today feminism is not adapted to our reality or that it is not needed anymore. According to a study led by the Pew Research Center in 2020, 30% of Americans thinks that the feminism is outdated. In fact, women's rights have evolved a lot through history, giving each time more and more independence to women. One of the key movements in women's history dates back to the 20th century, the so-called suffragettes. Oh, I've already heard about that term, but what is it exactly?
Well, the suffragettes were British women taking action and sometimes even becoming violent in order to get the right to vote and have access to a better education.
But what were they doing exactly?
Well, they were breaking window shops, they were giving tracts to people, and sometimes even burning places. In October 1908, Emmeline Pankhurst, main leader and founder of the movement, incited others to march to the parliament in order to ask for the right to vote.
Ooh, I've heard that that day more than 60,000 women were marching towards the parliament, repeating their famous motto, deeds, not words.
Yes, exactly. However, breaking the law was not left unpunished by the authorities.
Really? What did they do?
Well, many women were imprisoned, but it didn't stop them from fighting. In fact, women were still striking in prison through the famous hunger strikes. The latter led to horrible responses from the authorities. The suffragettes were force fed.
Was it because letting a suffragette die in prison would bring too much attention to the movement?
Exactly. And it would also enable them to have a certain power, like the power to fight, even in prison. So not letting them die was really important for the authority.
However, feminism wasn't taking only place in Britain. On the other side of the ocean, the USA were also facing a lot of different waves of feminism. Historians have found four different waves of feminism there.
Really? I've never heard about that. Can you explain more the different phases of feminism?
For sure.
For sure.
The first wave, from the mid 19th century to 1920, focused on women's suffrage and legal rights, such as property ownership, divorce right, access to education, following the Civil War.
So it was kind of similar to the suffragettes in Great Britain, right?
It was indeed a bit similar, and we can see it with the 19th Amendment, which was voted in 1920, which granted women the right to vote in the United States. And we can also see the story of Susan B. Anthony, who was arrested in 1872 for illegally voting. But then we come to the second wave, from 1960s to the early 1980s, which addressed issues like workplace equality and reproductive rights. It was, for example, influenced by the publication of The Feminine Mystique in 1963, and we can quote some famous names, such as Betty Friedan, who was the author of Feminine Mystic. He criticized the idea that women should only find fulfillment as wives and mother. We can also quote the Equal Pay Act in 1963. And we come to the third wave, from the mid 1990 to the early 2010s, which emphasize individualism and diversity within feminism. So that's the wave in which we talked about intersectionality, which is understanding how race, class, gender, and sexuality overlap, and where we also had reactions to the limits of the second wave feminism. We can, for example, quote Rebecca Walker, who advocated for inclusive feminism.
What about the fourth wave?
The fourth wave is the one we still have now, and it's my favorite. It started in 2010s to nowadays, and it uses digital platforms to fight against sexual harassment and promote intersectionality. So it is challenging systemic power structures. And we can, for example, quote the hashtag MeToo in 2017, or Tarana Burke, who started the Me Too movement in 2006.
So, if I understood well, the fourth different waves started by being very specific and very centered on white middle class women. And then the more time had passed, the more it was inclusive and less specific. So now we could think that today everything that needed to be changed has indeed changed, that feminism is not needed anymore, and that equality has been reached.
But are you serious? Feminism still is an actual matter. There are so many countries in which women are denied basic rights.
You're right. Let's have a look at the situation in the USA today. After less than half a century, the Roe versus Wade decision of 1973 has been overturned by the US Supreme Court. Today, it is no longer possible for women to get abortion in the USA. In fact, they're not protected by the Constitution. This right is not protected by the Constitution. It depends on each state.
That's true, and it had direct implications since then. For example, in 2022 in Nebraska, there was the case of Celeste Burgess and her mother. Celeste Burgess was a teenager who wanted to do an abortion, and she went into another state so she could have that abortion there. But she sent message to her mother to keep her in touch and to tell her how it went. All of the messages were on Facebook and were requested by the law enforcement and used as evidence of the fact that she aborted. She was sued because of that and she was condemned in her own state. That means that women no longer have controls over their bodies to choose if they want to get an abortion or not.
No way, this story is so shocking.
This is really shocking indeed.
But let's forget a bit about the USA and focus more on recent and terrible topics. Women's lives in Iran and Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, since the Taliban took power, women's rights are slowly but surely disappearing.
Women don't have the right to have a higher education than sixth grade, above sixth grade. They don't have the right to hear a woman's voice in public. They don't have the right to show some millimeters of skin. They don't have the right to go to gym, to go to parks. This past month, the Taliban have voted a new law which authorized domestic violence in the familial cell. Women basically don't even have the right to pursue someone in court.
So they basically have less rights than a rat.
That is indeed described as the worst crisis which has happened to women since the antiquity.
Now let's talk about Iran, where women are experiencing a similar reality. Security forces have increased physical violence against women and girls who are not supposedly respecting the regulations regarding the mandatory hijab. And sorry for my pronunciation.
That's true. No regulations are being implemented regarding that matter, authorizing exorbitant fines and making the regulation more strict about women. It makes the violence institutionalized and systemic against the women.
This idea is expressed in the comic Persepolis, written by Marjane Satrapi.
That's fair. In this comic, we realize the fact that history and rights for women are not linear. Especially, we can see the fact that after the Islamic Revolution in 1979, when the Shah got overthrown, the rights accorded to women are going more and more little. So kids are segregated in school. There are schools for women, for girls, and schools for boys, etc. And there is a strict moral rules that are used to control women's body.
But even in more advanced countries in gender equality, there are still issues that need to be addressed. Because a strong legal equality does not eliminate social norms, social repression, gender norms, and gender based violence. In France, for example, there is a form of repression and social control, and even some kind of regression of women's rights on their bodies as revealed by social injunctions.
That's true. Actually, gender based violence and harassment issues still remain big problems. In France, in 2023, the French Ministère de l'Intérieur, so the inner minister, said that 118 women were killed by the men they lived with, so their husband.
That's true, these are the official numbers. But we also have to keep in mind that some cases are never reported by women, also because it is not maybe a woman being killed, but more like cyber harassment, sexual harassment, or physical violence, whatever it might be. So these cases are not reported or are often not taken as seriously by authorities.
Or we can also talk about the clean girl aesthetic, which can be read as a form of social control over the woman's lives. It promotes a very narrow idea of femininity, looking always natural but actually really curated, looking always thin, youthful, sorry, and not useful, um, successful but also really discreet and always put together. It reinforces the long standing beauty norms under the label of naturalness. As we've seen it today, feminism is still necessary because history is not linear and is not always becoming better, as we've seen it with countries that are going backward in terms of women's rights.
We have to be careful and continue fighting for our rights and other women's rights.
Even if it's not happening in our country, we need to be careful and we need to fight because it could happen in our country and we could be the next one to lose what took us years to reach.
As Simone de Beauvoir once said it, never forget that it only takes one political, economic, or religious crisis for women's rights to be put in jeopardy. Those rights are never to be taken for granted. You must remain vigilant throughout your life.